The early life of Dr. John Watson. A gentle beginning. Let us begin at the very beginning, with a man who would become one of literature's most steadfast companions. John Hamish Watson was born in the year 1852, though some accounts suggest it may have been as early as 184. 7. The exact date lost to the mists of Victorian record-keeping. What we do know is that he came into the world during the reign of Queen Victoria, in an England that was rapidly transforming through industry and empire. Young John grew up with at least one sibling, a brother whose name we know, Henry Watson, sometimes called James in certain retellings. This brother would later struggle with alcoholism, a painful family matter that would weigh on John's heart in years to come. The Watson family was respectable, though not wealthy, and they instilled in young John the values of duty, honor, and service that would define his entire life. As a boy growing up in mid-Victorian England, John would have witnessed a world of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages, of strict social hierarchies and expanding horizons. Something in his character, perhaps a desire to help others, perhaps a thirst for adventure, or perhaps simply practical necessity, drew him toward the medical profession. This was no small undertaking. Medical training in Victorian England was rigorous and expensive, requiring years of study and dedication. John Watson pursued his medical degree at the University of London, one of the great institutions of learning in the Empire. There, among the lecture halls and dissection rooms, he learned the art and science of healing. He studied anatomy and physiology, pharmacology and surgery, absorbing knowledge that would serve him throughout his life. The medical training of his era was both theoretical and intensely practical, and young Watson proved himself capable and diligent. Upon completing his degree as a doctor of medicine, Watson made a choice that would alter the entire course of his life. Rather than establishing a comfortable practice in London or some provincial town, he joined the British Army Medical Department. This decision placed him in the Army Medical Service, where he would serve as a military surgeon, a role that combined medicine with the demands and dangers of military life. It was 1878 when he completed his training at Netley, the Royal Victoria Hospital where Army doctors learned their craft, and he was soon assigned to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers as an assistant surgeon. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for the young Dr. Watson. Before he could even join his regiment properly, he was removed from his original posting and attached instead to the Berkshires, the 66th Regiment of Foot. This reassignment would prove momentous, for it was with the Berkshires that Watson would travel far from England's shores, to a land of mountains and deserts, of ancient cultures and modern conflicts. The destination was Afghanistan, where the Second Anglo-Afghan War was being fought. Britain, in its imperial anxiety over Russian expansion, had invaded Afghanistan to secure its interests in what was called the Great Game, that vast geopolitical struggle for influence across Central Asia. For Watson, this meant leaving behind the familiar comforts of England for one of the most challenging postings in the entire British Empire. Afghanistan in 1880 was a brutal theatre of war. The terrain was unforgiving, high mountain passes, scorching deserts, and valleys where every rock could conceal danger. Watson arrived in this harsh land as a military surgeon, responsible for the care of wounded soldiers in conditions that were often primitive and always difficult. He would have seen the worst that war could offer: shattered bodies, epidemic diseases, and the psychological toll of combat far from home. It was during the Battle of Maiwand, fought on July 27, 1880, that John Watson's life changed forever. This was one of the worst defeats suffered by British forces in Afghanistan. A disastrous engagement where Afghan forces under Ayub Khan overwhelmed a smaller British and Indian force. The battle was chaos, a desperate struggle for survival as the British line broke and retreat became a rout. Watson, in the midst of this maelstrom, was struck by a Giselle bullet, a heavy slug fired from one of the long muskets favored by Afghan warriors. The wound was grievous. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, though some accounts place it in the leg. Perhaps he suffered multiple injuries in that terrible day, or perhaps the trauma of the experience left the details confused even in his own memory. What is certain is that Watson was badly wounded, weakened by pain and shock, and would likely have been killed or captured had it not been for the loyalty of his orderly. This man, whose name Watson would later record as Murray, showed extraordinary courage. Despite the danger, despite the panic of the retreat, Murray threw Watson across a packhorse and brought him to safety behind British lines, saving his life at great personal risk. And so we leave Dr. Watson for now, wounded and fevered, being carried to safety across the harsh Afghan landscape, his life preserved by a thread of loyalty and luck. His adventure, though he did not yet know it, was only beginning. The wound that should have been his end would instead become the thread that would lead him to a meeting, a friendship, and a legacy that would echo through the ages. The return and the meeting, a friendship begins. Let us return now to Dr. John Watson, wounded and far from home, beginning the long and painful journey back to England. After the horror of Maiwand, Watson was transported to the base hospital at Peshawar, a frontier city on the edge of British India. There, in the sweltering heat, with the sounds of the bustling bazaar drifting through the hospital windows, Watson began what should have been his recovery. But fate had not yet finished testing him. While his wound slowly healed, or tried to heal, Watson was struck down by enteric fever, what we would today call typhoid. This disease was the scourge of military campaigns, claiming more soldiers than bullets ever did. The fever racked his body, leaving him weakened and emaciated, his strength drained away day by day. 4 weeks, Watson hovered in that uncertain space between life and death, his constitution worn down by the wound, the fever, and the accumulated hardships of the campaign. The doctors, his fellow medical men, did what they could, but there was little to be done except wait and hope. Eventually, mercifully, Watson's robust constitution began to reassert itself. He had survived, but he was a changed man. Not just in body, but in spirit. The Army Medical Board examined him and delivered their verdict. Dr. John Watson was no longer fit for service. After months of suffering, after coming so close to death in the service of the Empire, Watson was to be invalided out of the army and sent home to England. He was granted 9 months of leave to recover his health, and with it came a pension. 11 shillings and 6pence a day, a modest sum that would have to sustain him as he rebuilt his shattered life. And so Watson came back to London, arriving with no family to welcome him, no home to return to, no anchor in the vast metropolis. He took rooms at a private hotel in the Strand, that great thoroughfare running through the heart of London, connecting the city with Westminster. But London was expensive, terribly expensive for a man living on an army pension, and Watson quickly realized that his modest income was evaporating at an alarming rate. The hotel bills mounted, and Watson knew he could not continue this way for long. He needed to find cheaper lodgings, but London was a lonely place for a man who had lost touch with old friends and had no family nearby to offer support. Watson spent his days drifting through the city, a solitary figure among millions, drawn to the Criterion Bar and other establishments where a man might pass the time. He was neither happy nor particularly unhappy, simply existing in that peculiar state of suspension that follows great trauma, uncertain of what his future might hold. It was at the Criterion Bar, on a day in early January 1881, that chance intervened. Watson encountered a man he barely knew. Young Stamford, who had been a dresser, a surgical assistant, under Watson during his time at Bart's, St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. They greeted each other with the surprise and pleasure of unexpected reunion, and fell into easy conversation. When Watson mentioned that he was looking for cheaper lodgings, perhaps rooms to share with someone to split the costs, Stamford remarked that Watson was the second man that very day to speak those exact words. The other man, Stamford explained, was a fellow who worked at the hospital's chemical laboratory, conducting research of some kind. His name was Sherlock Holmes. Stamford's description was peculiar, almost cautionary. Holmes was a decent fellow, Stamford said, but a little too scientific in his approach to things, even beating corpses in the dissecting rooms to verify how far bruises might spread after death. He was knowledgeable in some areas, peculiarly ignorant in others, and altogether an eccentric sort of person. But he was looking for someone to share rooms, and he had already found a place, comfortable lodgings at 221B, Baker Street. Watson's curiosity was piqued. Within hours, Stamford had arranged an introduction, and Watson found himself at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, being led through its familiar corridors to the chemical laboratory. There, amid the beakers and test tubes, surrounded by the smell of chemicals and the evidence of countless experiments, stood a tall, thin young man of perhaps 27 years. He was over 6 feet in height, so lean as to seem even taller, with sharp, piercing eyes and a hawk-like nose that gave his face an alert, decisive expression. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Stamford said, making the introduction that would change both their lives forever. Holmes turned from his work with an expression of satisfaction, holding a test tube containing a solution he had been perfecting. A test for bloodstains, as it happened, though Watson did not yet know this. "How are you?" Holmes said warmly, gripping Watson's hand with a strength that was surprising in such thin fingers. "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." Watson was thunderstruck. How could this stranger, this man he had never met, possibly know where he had been? Holmes, seeing his amazement, smiled slightly, that knowing smile that Watson would come to recognize so well in the years ahead. It was not magic, Holmes would explain, but simple observation and deduction. Watson's bearing spoke of military service. His face was tanned but his wrists were pale, suggesting recent return from a tropical climate. The way he held his injured arm indicated a wound received there. And Afghanistan was where the British Army had been engaged. Elementary, really, once you knew how to look. Within minutes, Holmes and Watson were discussing the rooms at Baker Street. Holmes was forthright about his own peculiarities. His irregular hours, his occasional dark moods, his habit of conducting chemical experiments. Watson, in turn, mentioned his own quirks, including his bull-pup terrier, though curiously this dog would vanish from all future accounts, perhaps finding a new home when Watson moved in. By the time they parted that day, an agreement had been reached. They would view the rooms together the next day, and if both found them suitable, they would become flatmates at 221B, Baker Street. And so it was that on a cold January day, John Watson, wounded soldier, lonely veteran, man without purpose, found himself standing before a door that would become the most famous address in detective literature, about to begin a friendship that would give his life new meaning and adventure beyond anything he had imagined. Baker Street and the beginning, A new chapter opens. Let us step now through that famous doorway, into the world that would become John Watson's true home. The rooms at 221B, Baker Street were situated on the first floor. What Americans would call the second floor. Of a modest but respectable building owned by Mrs. Hudson, a long-suffering but kind-hearted landlady who would tolerate more chaos and peculiarity than perhaps any landlady in London's history. The lodgings consisted of 2 bedrooms and a shared sitting room, which Holmes and Watson would use as their common space, filled with comfortable if somewhat shabby furniture, and lit by the glow of gaslight and a coal fire. Watson took up residence there in early 1881, and almost immediately found himself drawn into the strange world of Sherlock Holmes. The sitting room quickly became a reflection of Holmes's extraordinary mind and eccentric habits. Chemistry apparatus stood on a side table, filling the air with acrid smells. Newspapers were stacked everywhere, marked and cross-referenced. The violin, Holmes's beloved Stradivarius, which he would play at all hours, rested in its case near the window. And there was the Persian slipper on the mantelpiece, where Holmes kept his tobacco, much to the dismay of any conventional houseguest. Watson soon discovered that his new flatmate kept the strangest hours imaginable. Holmes might remain in bed until late afternoon one day, then stay awake for days on end the next, consumed by some case or experiment. When engaged in an investigation, Holmes became a force of nature. Barely eating, surviving on coffee and cigarettes, his mind working at a fever pitch. But when no case presented itself, Holmes would sink into periods of profound lethargy, lying upon the sofa for days, barely speaking, his sharp mind tormented by inactivity and boredom. It was during these early months at Baker Street that Watson witnessed something that would trouble him for years to come. When Holmes was between cases and sinking into one of his black moods, he would sometimes reach for relief in a form that Watson, as a medical man, found deeply concerning. Holmes used cocaine, a 7% solution, which he would inject using a hypodermic syringe kept in a Morocco leather case. In the 1880s, cocaine was legal and even viewed by some as medicinal, but Watson recognized the danger immediately. He would remonstrate with Holmes about this habit, arguing from medical knowledge about the damage such drugs could do to the system, but Holmes would wave away his concerns, insisting that his mind required stimulation and that routine was unbearable to him. Despite this troubling habit, Watson found himself increasingly fascinated by his flatmate's methods and character. Holmes made his living as what he called a consulting detective. The world's first and only one, he claimed with justifiable pride. While Scotland Yard had its official detectives and there were private inquiry agents scattered throughout London, Holmes occupied a unique position. He was the specialist whom other detectives consulted when they were baffled, the court of last resort for seemingly impossible problems. His knowledge in certain areas was profound and precise, yet Watson discovered that Holmes was peculiarly ignorant about matters that most educated men would consider basic knowledge. Watson, in those early weeks of their acquaintance, famously drew up a list of Holmes's limitations and abilities, attempting to categorize this strange mind he now lived with. Holmes's knowledge of literature, philosophy, and astronomy was nil. He didn't even know that the Earth revolved around the Sun, and when Watson told him, Holmes declared his intention to forget it immediately, as it was useless information that would only clutter his mental attic. Yet his knowledge of chemistry was profound, his understanding of anatomy accurate if unsystematic, and his grasp of sensational literature, particularly accounts of crimes, was immense. He could identify at a glance the difference between various types of tobacco ash, knew the distinguishing features of dozens of different types of soil found around London, and could trace the history of any major crime committed in recent decades. The true revelation of Holmes's genius came with Watson's first direct involvement in a case. The affair that Watson would later chronicle as a study in scarlet. A letter arrived one morning from Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard, requesting Holmes's assistance with a baffling murder. A man had been found dead in an abandoned house in Lauriston Gardens, off the Brixton Road, with no mark of violence upon him but with the word "rash" written in blood on the wall nearby. Holmes invited Watson to accompany him, and Watson, his interest in life rekindled by this strange development, eagerly accepted. That investigation opened Watson's eyes to Holmes's extraordinary method. Where others saw only confusion, Holmes saw a story written in footprints and ash, in the arrangement of objects and the expression on a dead man's face. He could reconstruct entire sequences of events from the smallest physical evidence, thinking both backward from effect to cause and forward from cause to effect with equal facility. Watson watched in amazement as Holmes examined the scene, measuring distances, examining scratches on the floor, sniffing at a dead man's lips, and gathering information that would prove crucial to solving the mystery. But it was not just Holmes's intellectual abilities that impressed Watson during this first case. It was also his physicality and his courage. Holmes was a formidable athlete and fighter, despite his lean frame. He was an expert single-stick player, boxer, and swordsman, with a knowledge of martial arts that included baritsu, or bartitsu, a form of Japanese wrestling mixed with other fighting techniques. His wiry strength was deceptive, and Watson would learn that Holmes could be dangerous when necessary, though he always preferred intellect to violence. As the case of the Lauriston Gardens murder unfolded, leading eventually to the capture of the murderer, a cab driver named Jefferson Hope, driven by a terrible revenge, Watson found that his own health was improving remarkably. The wound in his shoulder still troubled him at times, particularly when the weather changed, and he walked with a slight limp, but the mental stimulation of Holmes's company and the excitement of the investigation had done more for his constitution than months of rest had achieved. He was sleeping better, eating better, and most importantly, he had found a purpose again. It was during the conclusion of this first case that Watson made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would write about Holmes's methods, chronicling the cases for publication, sharing with the world the remarkable deductive abilities of his friend. Holmes was skeptical, even dismissive, insisting that Watson romanticized what was simply logical reasoning, but Watson persisted. He took up his pen and began to write, transforming himself from a wounded soldier adrift in London into something new. A chronicler, a biographer, a storyteller who would ensure that the world knew of the extraordinary Sherlock Holmes. The sign of For and Affairs of the Heart, Love Comes to Baker Street. Let us move forward now through time, to the summer of 1888, when life at Baker Street had settled into its peculiar rhythm. Watson had been sharing lodgings with Sherlock Holmes for over 7 years, and in that time he had witnessed many strange cases and remarkable demonstrations of his friend's abilities. But he had also watched with growing concern as Holmes's drug habit continued, particularly during those empty periods when no interesting cases presented themselves to occupy that restless, extraordinary mind. It was in July of that year, on a warm evening with the windows thrown open to catch what breeze might stir in London's heavy air, that Watson found Holmes in the sitting room, reaching once again for the Morocco case containing his syringe. Watson's patience finally broke. He remonstrated with his friend more strongly than ever before, speaking as both a doctor and a friend about the damage Holmes was doing to his system. Holmes, already in one of his languid moods, barely defended himself, admitting that he found the routine of existence unbearably dull without the mental stimulation of a complex problem to solve. It was at this very moment, as if summoned by Holmes's complaint about the drabness of modern life, that a visitor arrived who would change everything. Though not in the way either man expected. Miss Mary Morstan was announced by Mrs. Hudson, and she entered the sitting room with an air of quiet dignity and obvious nervousness. She was a young woman, Watson would later recall, blonde and dainty, dressed in simple but tasteful clothing that suggested modest means but good breeding. Her face was regular and intelligent, marked by an expression of sweetness and determination that immediately caught Watson's attention. Miss Morstan had come to consult Mr. Holmes about a mystery that had troubled her for years. Her father, Captain Arthur Morstan, had been an officer in an Indian regiment stationed at the Andaman Islands. He had returned to England in 1878 and sent a telegram to his daughter asking her to meet him at the Langham Hotel. Mary had hurried there, only to find that her father had gone out the night before and never returned. He had simply vanished, leaving no trace, and despite all inquiries, no explanation had ever been found for his disappearance. But the mystery had deepened over the years, for beginning in 1882, Mary had received through the post, once each year, a single large and lustrous pearl, with no note or indication of who had sent it. Now, 6 years after these mysterious gifts had begun, Mary had received a letter asking her to meet someone at the Lyceum Theatre that very evening, and promising her justice for a wrong that had been done to her. Frightened but determined, she had come to Baker Street seeking Holmes's advice and assistance. Holmes, his ennui instantly dispelled by this intriguing problem, agreed at once to take the case. And Watson, looking at this brave young woman who sat before them, felt something stir in his heart that had been dormant since before his time in Afghanistan. The first tender shoots of love. Holmes, Watson, and Mary Morstan set out that evening for the appointed meeting, and thus began the adventure that Watson would later title The Sign of Four. The case would prove to be one of the most complex and dangerous that the Baker Street duo had yet encountered, involving a pact made years ago in India, a stolen treasure of immense value, a wooden-legged man and his companion, a savage from the Andaman Islands, and a chase through the dark waters of the Thames that would test both Holmes's deductive powers and Watson's courage. Throughout this investigation, which unfolded over several intense days and nights, Watson found himself falling deeper and deeper in love with Mary Morstan. He admired her courage in the face of danger, her kindness, her intelligence, and her quiet dignity even when confronted with shocking revelations about her father's past. She, in turn, seemed to appreciate Watson's steady reliability, his medical knowledge, his gentle manner, and the protective instinct he showed toward her during the more perilous moments of the investigation. The case reached its climax with a dramatic boat chase down the Thames, pursuing the wooden-legged Jonathan Small and his deadly companion Tonga in the steam launch called the Aurora. Holmes had engaged the services of a Baker Street irregular named Wiggins and his band of street urchins to locate the boat, and when it was found, the chase was on. Watson, armed with his old service revolver, found himself once again in danger, once again called upon to use the courage he had shown at Maiwand. When Tonga appeared from below deck, armed with poisoned darts, it was Watson who fired, striking down the savage and saving both Holmes and himself from a terrible death. Jonathan Small was captured and brought back to Scotland Yard, where he told his remarkable story. A tale of the Indian Mutiny, of a pact made between 4 convicts and a prison guard, of a magnificent treasure and the curse that seemed to follow it. But for Watson, the most important consequence of the case was not the solution to the mystery, but the revelation of his own feelings and, he hoped, Mary's feelings in return. The Agra treasure, which had been at the heart of all the mystery and violence, was lost, thrown into the Thames by Small rather than let it be recovered. This loss, Watson discovered, brought him nothing but relief and joy. For had Mary Morstan inherited that vast fortune, she would have been lifted far above his station, and he, a simple army doctor living on a modest pension, could never have presumed to speak of love to a wealthy heiress. But with the treasure gone, they were equals again. 2 people of modest means who might build a life together on affection and mutual respect rather than on jewels and gold. Watson proposed marriage to Mary Morstan, and she accepted. In that moment, standing together in the aftermath of danger and mystery, Watson felt a happiness he had not known since before his wounding in Afghanistan. He had found not just a companion, but a partner, someone who understood both the gentle, caring side of his nature and the adventurous, courageous side that had led him to Afghanistan and now kept him at Holmes's side through dangerous investigations. And so preparations began for a wedding, for a new chapter in Watson's life. He would marry his Mary and establish a household of his own, leaving the bachelor quarters of Baker Street to become a husband and, eventually, perhaps a father. Holmes, true to his nature, showed little emotion about the prospect, dismissing romance and marriage as emotional distractions that clouded the mind. But Watson thought he detected, beneath the surface of his friend's cool rationality, a hint of something else. Perhaps a touch of melancholy at the prospect of losing his companion, perhaps even the faintest recognition that some things mattered more than logic and deduction. Marriage and practice, a domestic life begins. Let us turn now to a quieter chapter in the life of John Watson, though quiet does not mean uneventful, nor does it mean that adventure had entirely left his life. In 1889, Watson married his beloved Mary Morstan in a ceremony that was likely modest and intimate, befitting their circumstances and characters. Holmes, one imagines, attended. Though he would have fidgeted through the vows and found the whole affair rather tedious, being a man who viewed romance as the emotional equivalent of grit in a sensitive instrument. But for Watson, it was the beginning of everything he had hoped for: a home, a partnership, a normal life after years of wounds and wandering. After the wedding, Watson and Mary established their household, and Watson made a significant professional decision. He purchased a medical practice in the Paddington area of London, not far from Baker Street but far enough to represent a new independence. The practice had been established by an elderly doctor named Farquhar, who sold it to Watson, along with its existing patients and goodwill, for a price that Watson could manage with his savings and pension. It was located on a respectable street, with rooms above the surgery where Watson and Mary could live, creating that Victorian ideal of home and workplace united under one roof. The practice itself was modest but solid, bringing in enough income to support a comfortable if not luxurious lifestyle. Watson would see patients throughout the day. Why, the usual run of ailments that a general practitioner in late Victorian London might expect. Respiratory complaints from the coal-smoke-laden air, digestive troubles, the occasional accident or injury, childhood diseases, and the chronic conditions of aging patients. He was known as a kind and thorough doctor, patient with the elderly, gentle with children, and understanding with those whose complaints were as much emotional as physical. His experience as an army surgeon had given him steady hands and nerves for the more serious cases, though the dramatic emergencies of military medicine were mercifully rare in Paddington. Mary proved to be an ideal wife for a busy doctor. She managed their household with efficiency and grace, overseeing their small staff. Likely a housemaid and perhaps a daily woman who came to help with the heavier cleaning. She greeted Watson's patients when they called at odd hours, made him comfortable when he returned tired from his rounds, and created in their home an atmosphere of warmth and peace that Watson had not known since childhood. She read to him in the evenings, discussed the cases that interested him, and never complained when he was called away suddenly to attend to an emergency more frequently than she might have liked. When a telegram arrived from Baker Street. For Watson could not, entirely leave behind his connection to Sherlock Holmes. Though he was no longer a permanent resident at 221B, though his days were now filled with the ordinary concerns of marriage and medical practice, Holmes still called upon him when cases arose that required a companion. These summons came irregular. Why, sometimes months would pass without word, then suddenly an urgent message would arrive. Come at once if convenient. If inconvenient, come anyway. And Watson would go, leaving Mary with apologies and promises to return soon, drawn by the old excitement, the old loyalty, and something deeper. A connection to Holmes that even marriage could not entirely supersede. Mary, to her great credit, understood this aspect of her husband's character better than Watson might have expected. She knew that he needed both lives. The domestic stability she provided and the intellectual adventure that Holmes offered. She never demanded that he choose between them, never issued ultimatums or sulked when he departed for Baker Street. Perhaps she recognized that the man she had fallen in love with during the Sign of Four investigation was, in part, the man that Holmes had helped to create. Watson the chronicler, Watson the adventurer, Watson the loyal friend. To demand he give that up would be to demand he give up part of himself. During this period of his marriage, Watson continued his practice of writing up Holmes's cases for publication. He had already seen A Study in Scarlet published in Beeton's Christmas Annual in 1887, though it had not made a tremendous splash at the time. Now he was working on the account of the Sign of Four, which would be published in Lippincott's monthly magazine in 1890. Watson wrote in the evenings, after his medical work was done, sitting at his desk while Mary sewed or read nearby, transforming his notes and memories into narratives that would captivate readers. Holmes remained skeptical of these literary efforts, grumbling that Watson sensationalized what was merely logical deduction, but Watson persisted, driven by a belief that the world should know of his friend's extraordinary gifts. It was during one of these visits to Baker Street, in the spring of 1891, that Watson noticed something troubling about his friend. Holmes seemed preoccupied, even agitated, constantly checking the windows and starting at unexpected sounds. When Watson questioned him, Holmes revealed that he was engaged in what he called his greatest case. Tracking Professor James Moriarty, a criminal mastermind who controlled a vast network of crime across London and beyond. Holmes spoke of Moriarty with a mixture of professional admiration and personal concern, describing him as a genius turned to evil, a mathematician of the first order who had created an organization so sophisticated that Scotland Yard had no idea it even existed. The situation, Holmes explained, was reaching a crisis point. He had been systematically dismantling Moriarty's organization, gathering evidence against the professor and his chief associates. But Moriarty knew what Holmes was doing, and the two had entered into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Holmes had already survived 3 attempts on his life in a single day. A runaway van that nearly struck him, a falling brick that missed his head by inches, and an attack by a ruffian with a cudgel that Holmes had barely fended off. The professor had called upon Holmes that very afternoon, politely warning him to cease his investigations or face the consequences. Watson, hearing all this, felt the old protective instinct rise within him. His friend was in danger, real danger, and Watson's place was at his side. When Holmes announced his intention to leave England for a time, to disappear to the continent until the police could arrest Moriarty's gang, Watson immediately offered to accompany him. Holmes tried to dissuade him, pointing out that Watson had responsibilities. A wife, a practice, a life that should not be abandoned on a whim. But Watson was resolute. He would arrange for a colleague to cover his practice, he would explain to Mary, and he would go with Holmes. Some things, he understood, transcended even the bonds of marriage. Friendship, loyalty, and the duty one man owed another when danger threatened. And so Watson prepared to leave his comfortable home, his practice, his dear wife, to follow Sherlock Holmes into what would become one of the most dramatic episodes of their entire association. Mary, understanding as always, helped him pack and sent him off with her blessing. She kissed him goodbye at the door of their Paddington home, and Watson departed, not knowing that this adventure would end with news that would shake him to his very core, that would make him believe, for a time, that he had lost the best and wisest friend he had ever known. The Reichenbach Fall, a darkness descends. Let us follow now as Watson journeys across the Channel with Holmes, leaving behind the safety of England for the uncertain paths of continental Europe. The two men travelled first to the continent in April of 1891, with Holmes taking elaborate precautions to ensure they were not followed. They made their way through France, moving from place to place with the careful attention of men who knew they might be hunted. Holmes was tense, vigilant, constantly watching for signs that Moriarty or his agents had picked up their trail. Watson, though he tried to remain cheerful for his friend's sake, felt the weight of the situation pressing upon them both. Their wanderings eventually brought them to Switzerland, that picturesque land of mountains and valleys, of clean air and spectacular vistas. After the grime and fog of London, after the tension of their flight across France, Switzerland seemed almost impossibly peaceful. They spent a week walking through the alpine landscape, staying in small villages, breathing air that was crisp and pure. Watson found himself relaxing despite the circumstances, enjoying the physical exercise, the stunning scenery, and the companionship of his friend. Holmes, too, seemed to ease somewhat, though he remained watchful, and spoke often of his hope that by now the London police had arrested Moriarty's organization, allowing them to return home safely. In early May, they arrived at the small village of Meiringen, nestled in a valley in the Bernese Oberland region of Switzerland. It was a charming place, the sort of alpine village that seemed untouched by the modern world's troubles. They took rooms at the Englischer Hof, a hotel that catered to British tourists, and settled in for what Watson hoped would be a restful stay. The landlord, Peter Steiler, was a jovial Swiss gentleman who took pride in showing his English guests the local attractions. He particularly recommended that they visit the nearby Reichenbach Falls, describing it as one of the most impressive waterfalls in all of Switzerland. On May 4, 1891, Holmes and Watson set out to visit these famous falls. The walk from Meiringen took them up a steep mountain path, winding through pine forests and along rocky slopes. As they climbed higher, they could hear the roar of the falls growing louder, a deep, thunderous sound that spoke of immense power and force. When they finally reached the viewing point, Watson stood in awe. The Reichenbach Falls was a fearsome sight. A tremendous torrent of water plunging down into a deep chasm, throwing up spray and mist, the water appearing green-tinged against the black rock, the whole scene creating an impression of nature's raw, terrible power. They had been standing there, admiring this natural spectacle, when a Swiss boy appeared on the path. He carried a letter, which he presented to Watson. The letter, written on hotel stationery and appearing to be from the landlord Steiler, explained that an English lady staying at the hotel had been taken suddenly and seriously ill. She was a consumptive, the letter said, only a few hours from death, and she had expressed a desperate wish to be attended by an English doctor. Would Dr. Watson be so kind as to return to the hotel immediately to provide what comfort he could to this dying countrywoman? Watson's medical conscience was immediately stirred. Here was someone in need, a fellow Englander far from home, facing death in a foreign land. He felt he had no choice but to return at once. Holmes encouraged him to go, saying that he himself would wait at the falls a while longer, enjoying the scene and perhaps making some notes. They agreed that Watson would return as quickly as possible, and the two friends parted. Holmes standing at the edge of the precipice, his pipe in hand, gazing at the thundering waters, and Watson hurrying back down the mountain path with the Swiss boy. But as Watson descended the path, a terrible realization began to dawn on him. Something about the letter troubled him. Small details that his medical mind began to question. When he reached the hotel and made inquiries, his worst fears were confirmed. There was no sick English lady. No one at the hotel had sent for him. The letter had been a deception, a ruse to separate him from Holmes. And the Swiss boy who had delivered it had vanished, no doubt having been paid to play his part in the scheme. Watson's blood ran cold. He had left Holmes alone at the falls, and Holmes's enemy, Professor Moriarty, was still at large. Watson turned immediately and began running back up the mountain path, his heart pounding with fear and exertion. His old war-wound protested at this sudden demand, but he ignored it, driven by desperate urgency. He had to reach Holmes, had to warn him, had to be there to stand beside his friend against whatever danger awaited. But even as he climbed, Watson knew in his heart that he was likely too late. The letter had been clever, perfectly calculated to achieve exactly what it had achieved. Watson's absence at the crucial moment. When Watson reached the Reichenbach Falls again, gasping for breath, the scene was peaceful. Terribly, ominously peaceful. Holmes was nowhere to be seen. Watson called out, his voice nearly drowned by the roar of the falls, but there was no answer. He searched frantically, examining every inch of the narrow path, and then he saw it. Holmes's alpine-stock, his walking stick, left carefully placed against a rock. Beside it was Holmes's cigarette case. And nearby, on a small outcropping of rock, was a piece of paper weighted down with a stone, addressed to Watson in Holmes's distinctive handwriting. Watson picked up the letter with trembling hands and read the words that would haunt him for years to come. Holmes explained that he had known this confrontation with Moriarty was inevitable, that the professor had followed them to Switzerland for a final reckoning. Holmes wrote that he had left this note knowing that Moriarty would allow him a few moments to do so, as a courtesy between two men of intelligence who understood each other perfectly. He expressed his confidence that with Moriarty's death, for surely they would destroy each other in their final struggle, London would be free of the criminal network that had plagued it. And he said goodbye to Watson, the friend who had chronicled his adventures, calling him the best and wisest man he had ever known. Watson examined the ground with eyes that had been trained by Holmes himself to observe and deduce. He saw the footprints, 2 sets leading to the edge of the precipice, none returning. He saw the marks of struggle in the soft earth at the path's edge. He looked down into the awful chasm where the Reichenbach Falls thundered into depths shrouded by spray and mist, and he understood what had happened. Holmes and Moriarty had fought their final battle there on that narrow ledge, and both had fallen, locked together, plunging down into that terrible abyss. Sherlock Holmes was gone, and with him had gone something vital from Watson's world. Something he feared could never be replaced. The empty years, a life without Holmes. Let us remain now with Watson in the aftermath of that terrible day, standing alone beside the Reichenbach Falls, holding a letter that was both a farewell and a testament. The Swiss authorities were called, searches were conducted, but the body of Sherlock Holmes was never recovered from those terrible depths. The waters gave up no trace of either Holmes or Professor Moriarty. Watson returned to England in a state of profound grief, carrying with him Holmes's few belongings. The alpine-stock, the cigarette case, and that final letter, which he would treasure for the rest of his days. The journey back to London was a blur of sorrow and shock. Watson had to break the news to Mrs. Hudson, who wept at the loss of her unusual but beloved lodger. He had to face the rooms at 221B, Baker Street, now empty of the presence that had animated them, the violin silent, the chemistry apparatus abandoned, the air no longer filled with tobacco smoke and the sound of Holmes's restless pacing. Watson gathered what he felt should be preserved, but much of Holmes's possessions were left as they were, Mrs. Hudson being reluctant to change the rooms, as if expecting at any moment that tall, lean figure to come bounding up the 17 steps once more. Watson returned to his practice in Paddington, to Mary's comforting presence, and tried to resume the normal life of a London doctor. But something had changed in him, something vital had been extinguished. Mary, dear Mary, understood the depth of his grief even if she could not entirely share it. She had only known Holmes briefly, during the adventure of the Sign of Four, but she understood what he had meant to her husband. Friend, colleague, the source of adventure and purpose that had restored Watson to life after the darkness of his war wounds. She gave Watson space to mourn, never suggesting that he should simply forget or move on, but offering quiet support and understanding. In 1893, Watson published The Final Problem, his account of those terrible events at Reichenbach Falls. It was his way of honoring Holmes's memory, of ensuring that the world knew not only of Holmes's brilliance but also of his courage and his willingness to sacrifice himself to rid London of Moriarty's evil influence. The publication created a sensation. The public, which had been following Watson's chronicles of Holmes's adventures with growing enthusiasm, was shocked and dismayed. Many readers refused to believe that Holmes was truly dead. Some even wrote to Watson, angry that he had allowed such an ending, as if Watson himself were to blame for the tragedy rather than merely its chronicler and witness. But even as Watson mourned and the public grieved, life continued to make its demands. Watson's medical practice required his attention. Patients still needed care, illnesses still needed treating, and the daily rounds of a London doctor could not be postponed for grief. Watson threw himself into his work with perhaps more dedication than before, using the demands of his profession as a way to occupy his mind and fill the emptiness left by Holmes's absence. He saw patients from morning until evening, made house calls throughout Paddington and beyond, and rarely refused a case no matter how inconvenient the hour. Then, in 1894, tragedy struck Watson again, though the details remained shrouded in a reticence that was typical of Victorian gentlemen when discussing personal sorrows. Mary Watson, Watson's beloved wife, died. The cause of her death is never explicitly stated in Watson's chronicles, and we can only speculate. Perhaps it was illness, perhaps complications from childbirth, perhaps one of the many diseases that could strike suddenly in that era despite the best medical care. What we know with certainty is that Watson was devastated. In the space of 3 years, he had lost the two people who had meant most to him in the world. First Holmes, then Mary. With Mary gone, Watson found himself alone in their Paddington house, surrounded by reminders of the life they had built together. The practice continued, but it had lost much of its meaning for him. He was going through the motions of life rather than truly living. Some accounts suggest that during this dark period, Watson sold his practice and moved back into Baker Street, taking up residence once again in those familiar rooms, perhaps finding some comfort in being surrounded by memories of Holmes. Whether this happened immediately after Mary's death or somewhat later remains unclear, but what is certain is that Watson was adrift, having lost both his anchors. The domestic happiness Mary had provided and the intellectual excitement Holmes had offered. During these empty years, as Watson would later think of them, he continued to write. He had his notes from dozens of cases that he and Holmes had investigated together, and he began preparing more of these for publication. Writing became both a memorial to his lost friend and a way to keep some connection to those happier times when he had lived in the excitement of investigation and deduction. The stories appeared in the Strand magazine, a popular monthly publication that reached a wide readership. Each story renewed public interest in Sherlock Holmes, and each reminded Watson of what he had lost. Watson's social circle during this period seems to have contracted. His brother-in-law is mentioned once in passing, suggesting that he maintained some connection to Mary's family, but otherwise Watson appears to have withdrawn somewhat from society. He attended his club, likely the Army and Navy Club, or perhaps one of the other gentlemen's establishments in Pall Mall, and he maintained professional connections through his medical work, but the warm sociability that had characterized his earlier years seemed diminished. He was a man living in the shadow of loss, functioning but not flourishing. The rooms at Baker Street, whether Watson was living there permanently or merely visiting frequently, remained much as Holmes had left them. Mrs. Hudson, loyal as ever, kept them ready, dusting and cleaning but not substantially changing anything. The chemical apparatus remained on its side table, the books stayed in their chaotic arrangement, the Persian slipper still hung from the mantelpiece. It was as if the rooms themselves were waiting, as if they knew something that Watson did not, that the story was not yet finished, that one more extraordinary chapter remained to be written. And so Watson lived through those dark years, marking time, fulfilling his obligations, writing his chronicles of the past while believing he had no future worth anticipating. He could not know that in the spring of 1894, something impossible was about to occur, something that would shake the very foundations of his understanding and bring back into his life a presence he had believed lost forever. The empty years were drawing to a close, though Watson, in his grief and resignation, had no way of knowing that the greatest shock of his life was mere weeks away. The empty house, a resurrection beyond belief. Let us move forward now to the spring of 1894, to a day in late March or early April when London was beginning to shake off winter's grip and the first hints of warmth touched the city's grey streets. Watson had settled into a routine of sorts during the 3 years since Reichenbach. His medical work, his writing, his solitary evenings. On this particular day, he found himself with time on his hands and decided to take a walk, perhaps to clear his head, perhaps simply to pass the hours before returning to his empty lodgings. As Watson walked through the streets, his route took him past Baker Street, and almost without conscious decision, his feet carried him toward that familiar address. He had been doing this more often lately, walking past 221B, sometimes pausing to look up at the windows, remembering. On this day, he noticed a commotion near the corner of Baker Street and Marylebone Road. A small crowd had gathered, and Watson, with the curiosity that Holmes had cultivated in him, moved closer to see what had attracted their attention. What he learned chilled him. There had been a murder, the killing of a young man named Ronald Adair, shot in his locked room under circumstances that seemed utterly inexplicable. The case interested Watson despite himself. It bore the hallmarks of the kind of mystery that would have fascinated Holmes. Impossible circumstances, no apparent motive, peculiar details that seemed to defy rational explanation. Watson found himself examining the scene as Holmes might have done, looking for details that others might miss, though he knew his own powers of observation were pale shadows of his friend's genius. As he stood there, lost in thought, Watson became aware of an elderly, deformed book collector who seemed to be watching him with peculiar intensity. The old man was a distinctive figure, bent and twisted with age, carrying a stack of books, his face partially obscured by a tangle of white hair and beard. There was something unsettling about him, something that made Watson uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite identify why. The book collector approached Watson, apparently recognizing him, and began speaking about books in a rambling way that seemed designed to engage Watson's attention. Watson, naturally polite but eager to escape this odd encounter, tried to disengage, but the old man was persistent. As Watson made to leave, the elderly collector stumbled against him, dropping several books. Watson, ever the gentleman, bent to help retrieve them, and as he did so, the old man whispered something that made Watson's blood freeze in his veins. The words were innocuous enough to anyone else who might have overheard, but to Watson they carried an impossible meaning. He looked up sharply at the old man's face, and for just a moment, through the disguise of age and deformity, he saw something in those eyes. Something keen, alert, and achingly familiar. But before Watson could speak, before he could even form a coherent thought, the old book collector had straightened somewhat and was gesturing toward the direction of Baker Street, indicating that Watson should accompany him. In a daze of confusion and growing, impossible hope, Watson followed. They walked to 221B, and the old man produced a key to those familiar lodgings. He opened the door and gestured for Watson to precede him up the 17 steps. Watson climbed them as if in a dream, his heart pounding, his mind refusing to accept what his instincts were telling him. Watson's reaction was immediate and physical. The shock was too great, too sudden, too overwhelming for his system to process. The room spun around him, his vision narrowed, and for the first and only time in his adult life, John Watson fainted dead away. When he came to moments later, he found himself in a chair with Holmes leaning over him, pressing brandy to his lips and speaking his name with genuine worry. For a long moment, Watson could only stare, unable to speak, unable to do anything but look at this impossible apparition, this friend returned from the dead. When Watson finally found his voice, the questions poured out. How was this possible? How had Holmes survived the fall at Reichenbach? Why had he allowed Watson to believe him dead for 3 agonizing years? Holmes, settling into his old chair as if he had never left, began to explain. He had not fallen at Reichenbach after all. When he and Moriarty had struggled on that narrow ledge, Holmes had possessed knowledge that Moriarty did not. Holmes was an expert in Baritsu, the Japanese system of wrestling, and he had used this knowledge to throw Moriarty while saving himself. Holmes had clung to the rock face, finding purchase on a narrow ledge, and waited there while Moriarty's body tumbled down into the abyss. But Holmes had not immediately revealed his survival, even to Watson. This decision, Holmes explained with evident regret, had been necessary for his safety and his mission. Moriarty's organization, though decapitated by the professor's death, still had dangerous members at large, particularly Colonel Sebastian Moran, Moriarty's chief of staff and the second most dangerous man in London. These men would have stopped at nothing to avenge their leader, and Holmes knew that if anyone believed he had survived, he would be hunted relentlessly. Even Watson, dear Watson, could not be trusted with the secret. Not because Holmes doubted his friend's loyalty, but because Watson's very grief was the most convincing proof of Holmes's death. And so Holmes had disappeared, traveling under assumed names through Asia and Europe. He had spent 2 years in Tibet, he told Watson, traveling under the name of a Norwegian explorer and visiting Lhasa, where he spent days with the head lama. From there he had traveled to Persia, then to Mecca disguised as a pilgrim, and later to Khartoum in Sudan, where he had visited the Khalifa and delivered to the Foreign Office a report on his activities. He had then spent several months in Montpellier in southern France, conducting research into coal tar derivatives. Throughout this time, only Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock's older brother, had known the truth, and it was Mycroft who had preserved the Baker Street rooms and managed certain affairs on his brother's behalf. Watson sat in stunned silence, absorbing all of this, his emotions warring between joy at his friend's return and anger at the deception that had caused him 3 years of unnecessary grief. Holmes watched him with unusual uncertainty, perhaps wondering if this friendship could survive such a betrayal of trust, even one undertaken with good intentions. But Watson, looking at his friend, his living, breathing friend, felt the anger dissolving, replaced by overwhelming relief and the rekindling of something he had thought extinguished forever: hope, purpose, and the promise of adventures yet to come. The return and reunion, Baker Street restored. Let us remain in that sitting room at Baker Street, where Watson was slowly coming to terms with the impossible miracle of Holmes's return. The initial shock was giving way to a flood of questions, and Holmes, settling back into his chair with visible relief at being home, began to fill in more details of his extraordinary 3-year absence. He explained that his return to London had been precipitated by the Adair murder case, a crime that bore the unmistakable signature of Colonel Sebastian Moran, the last remaining pillar of Moriarty's criminal organization and a man so dangerous that Holmes had not dared return until circumstances forced his hand. Watson learned that Holmes had been back in London for several days already, preparing an elaborate trap for Moran. The empty house across from 221B, Baker Street. The abandoned building that gave its name to Watson's chronicle of these events had been turned into an observation post. Holmes had even arranged for a wax bust of himself to be placed in the window of their sitting room, positioned so that Moran, if he were watching, would believe Holmes was sitting in his usual chair. It was a dangerous game, using himself as bait, but Holmes was confident that with Watson's help, they could finally eliminate this last threat and make London safe again. That very night, Holmes and Watson took up their positions in the empty house, crouching in darkness and watching their own sitting room across the street. Watson felt time slip away. It was as if the 3 years of grief and loss had never happened, as if they were simply resuming their partnership where it had left off. They waited in silence, Holmes tense with anticipation, Watson gripping his revolver with the steady hand of a man who had faced danger many times before. And then, just as Holmes had predicted, a figure appeared in the darkness of the street below. Colonel Sebastian Moran, carrying an air rifle, preparing to shoot at the wax bust he believed was Holmes. The trap was sprung with perfect precision. As Moran took aim at the dummy in the window, Holmes and Watson, along with Inspector Lestrade who had been stationed nearby, moved in to make the arrest. Moran was captured, and with him fell the last remnant of Moriarty's evil empire. London was finally safe, Holmes's mission was complete, and the great detective could at last resume his public life. The newspapers the next day were filled with sensational accounts of Holmes's return from the dead, and the public, which had mourned his loss 3 years earlier, now rejoiced at this impossible resurrection. With Moran safely in custody and no further need for secrecy, Holmes and Watson resumed their old arrangement at Baker Street. Watson, who had been living alone or perhaps in temporary lodgings since Mary's death, moved back into his old room, taking up residence once more in those familiar quarters. It was as if the intervening years had been erased, as if they could simply pick up where they had left off before that terrible day at Reichenbach Falls. Mrs. Hudson fussed over them both, delighted to have her sitting room occupied again by her unusual but beloved tenants. The partnership resumed with an ease that surprised even Watson. Cases began arriving almost immediately. People who had heard of Holmes's miraculous return and who brought their problems to Baker Street in hopes that the great detective's abilities were undiminished by his long absence. Holmes threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, and Watson found himself once again playing the role he had perfected over the years. Companion, assistant, chronicler, and friend. They fell back into old patterns. Holmes sprawling on the sofa during periods of inactivity, playing his violin at odd hours, conducting chemical experiments that filled the rooms with strange smells, and Watson sitting in his chair, newspaper in hand, ready to be consulted or to offer his steady common sense when Holmes's theories grew too elaborate. Yet things had changed, subtly but unmistakably. Watson was older now, marked by loss and grief in ways that had aged him beyond the mere passage of years. The wound from Afghanistan still troubled him, particularly on damp days, and he walked with a more pronounced limp than he had in earlier years. His hair had begun to show grey, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of sorrow and sleepless nights. Holmes, too, had been marked by his experiences. The 3 years of wandering, the constant vigilance, the isolation from everything familiar. He seemed, if anything, even more driven than before, as if he had to make up for lost time, as if he feared that idleness might somehow steal from him the years he had regained. Watson resumed his practice of chronicling Holmes's cases, and the Strand magazine was delighted to continue publishing the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The public's appetite for these stories seemed insatiable, and Watson found himself with a ready outlet for his accounts of both new investigations and older cases from their first years together that he had never previously written up. He wrote of the adventure of the Norwood builder, one of their first cases after Holmes's return, and began preparing accounts of many other investigations that would keep readers enthralled for years to come. During this period, Watson also acquired a new medical practice, though the details of this arrangement are somewhat vague in his chronicles. Some accounts suggest he purchased a practice in the Queen and Street area, taking over from a Dr. Werner who sold it to him for a price that seemed remarkably reasonable. Watson would later discover that Werner was a distant relative of Holmes, and that Holmes himself had actually purchased the practice and arranged the sale at a favorable price as a way of ensuring Watson's financial independence while keeping him close to Baker Street. It was typical of Holmes, generous but secretive about his generosity, unwilling to embarrass Watson by making his charity obvious. The practice allowed Watson to maintain his professional identity and income while still being available when Holmes needed him for investigations. He would see patients in the mornings and early afternoons, then make himself available for whatever cases might call him to Baker Street. It was a delicate balance, and there must have been times when his patients were frustrated by his absences, but Watson managed it with the same steady reliability he brought to everything else in his life. And so the great detective and his faithful chronicler were reunited, their partnership restored, their rooms at Baker Street once again alive with the excitement of investigation and the comfortable rhythms of friendship. The empty years were behind them now, though the marks of those years remained, carried in their hearts like old wounds that ached in cold weather. They were older, perhaps wiser, certainly more aware of how precious and fragile their companionship was. But they were together again, and for Watson, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything he had thought lost, miraculously returned, a second chance at the life that gave his existence meaning and purpose. The Golden Years, Adventures in Edwardian England. Let us move forward now through the years that followed Holmes's return, years that would prove to be among the most productive and celebrated of their long partnership. The late 1890s and early 1900s saw a steady stream of cases arriving at 221B, Baker Street, each one adding to the legend of Sherlock Holmes and to Watson's growing collection of chronicles. These were the golden years of their collaboration, when both men were at the height of their powers. Holmes's mind as sharp as ever, Watson's pen capturing their adventures with an assurance born of long practice. Watson's accounts of their cases during this period reveal a fascinating variety of investigations. There was the adventure of the 6 Napoleons, a case that began with the peculiar destruction of plaster busts of Napoleon Bonaparte and led to the recovery of the famous Bourgeois pearl. Watson wrote of the adventure of the Second Stain, involving stolen political documents and matters of international importance so sensitive that Watson had to wait years before publishing his account. Each case demonstrated Holmes's remarkable abilities and Watson's own steady courage and practical good sense, the combination that made their partnership so effective. During these years, Watson married again, though the circumstances of this second marriage remain somewhat mysterious in his chronicles. Her name was never explicitly mentioned in the published accounts, and the timeline is unclear. Some scholars believe he may have married more than once during this period, while others argue that apparent references to multiple marriages are simply inconsistencies in Watson's record-keeping. What seems certain is that Watson once again established a household separate from Baker Street, once again attempted to balance domestic life with his partnership with Holmes, and once again found himself drawn back repeatedly to those familiar rooms when adventure called. The cases during this period took Holmes and Watson to various corners of England and occasionally beyond. They investigated the strange affair of the Hound of the Baskervilles, traveling to Dartmoor to confront what appeared to be a supernatural threat but proved to be a very human evil. This case, which took place in 1889, though Watson did not publish it until 1901, stood out in Watson's memory as one of their most atmospheric and chilling investigations. The desolate moors, the ancient legend, the phosphorescent hound all combined to create an adventure that tested both men's courage and determination. Holmes's methods during these mature years showed the refinement of long practice. He had developed an even more extensive network of informants throughout London. The Baker Street irregulars remained his eyes and ears in the streets, but he also cultivated sources in every level of society, from stable boys to society ladies, from pawnbrokers to politicians. His monographs on various specialized subjects continued to grow in number and reputation. He had published works on tobacco ash, on the tracing of footsteps, on the influence of trade on the form of the hand, and most notably, a treatise on the differentiation of over 140 varieties of pipe, cigar, and cigarette tobacco. Watson, for his part, had become a more skilled observer and investigator in his own right. Years of watching Holmes had taught him much, and while he would never possess his friend's genius for deduction, he had developed a solid competence that occasionally allowed him to surprise Holmes with an observation or insight. More importantly, Watson had perfected his role as the grounding force in their partnership. The man who could be relied upon in a crisis, whose medical skills had saved lives on numerous occasions, whose revolver had protected them both from danger, and whose steady common sense provided a necessary counterbalance to Holmes's sometimes reckless brilliance. The friendship between the two men had deepened over these years into something profound and unshakable. They had been through too much together, the early adventures, the tragedy at Reichenbach, the painful separation, and the joyous reunion, for their bond to be anything less than permanent. They understood each other's moods and habits with the intimacy of an old married couple. Watson knew when Holmes needed silence and when he needed conversation, when his friend's dark moods required intervention and when they would pass on their own. Holmes, in turn, respected Watson's need for occasional domesticity and independence, never demanding that Watson give up his own life entirely to serve as Holmes's companion, even though they both knew where Watson's truest happiness lay. The published accounts of their adventures during this period made both men famous throughout Britain and beyond. Watson's stories in the Strand magazine were eagerly awaited by readers who had come to love these characters. The brilliant, eccentric detective and his loyal, capable friend. Holmes affected to be annoyed by what he called Watson's romanticizing and sensationalizing of what were simply exercises in logical reasoning, but Watson suspected that his friend was secretly pleased by the recognition his work was receiving. Certainly Holmes made no serious effort to stop Watson from writing and publishing the accounts, and he occasionally even assisted by reviewing Watson's manuscripts and suggesting corrections to technical details. By the early 1900s, as Britain moved from the Victorian era into the Edwardian, as the old Queen died and her son Edward VII took the throne, Holmes and Watson had become British institutions in their own right. They represented something reassuring in a rapidly changing world. The power of reason over chaos, the triumph of justice over evil, the value of friendship and loyalty. People wrote to Baker Street asking for Holmes's help with real problems, despite the fact that he was a fictional character in published stories. Or perhaps not entirely fictional, as many readers suspected that Watson's accounts were thinly veiled reports of actual cases. The pace of their work during these years was intense. Watson's chronicles mention dozens of cases, some recorded in detail, others referred to only in passing. The giant rat of Sumatra, the politician, the lighthouse, and the trained cormorant, the amateur mendicant society, each tantalizingly brief reference suggesting adventures that Watson never found time to write up fully. Holmes seemed to thrive on this constant activity, his restless mind finding in each new puzzle the stimulation it craved. And Watson, dividing his time between his medical practice and his detective work, found in this busy life a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had sought ever since returning wounded from Afghanistan all those years ago. These were golden years indeed. Years of friendship and adventure, of mysteries solved and justice served, of two men working together in perfect harmony toward common purpose. Neither Holmes nor Watson could know that these productive years were approaching their end, that great changes were coming that would transform not just their partnership but the entire world they knew. For now, they had their work, they had each other, and they had the satisfaction of knowing that their efforts made the world, in some small way, a safer and more rational place. The twilight years, retirement and reflection. Let us turn now to the closing chapters of this remarkable partnership, as the new century progressed and both Holmes and Watson entered what would be the final phase of their extraordinary collaboration. By 1903, Holmes had begun to speak of retirement, a subject that had never before crossed his lips in all the years Watson had known him. The constant mental strain of his work, the unrelenting demands placed upon his faculties, and perhaps simply the accumulation of years and cases, had begun to wear on even his formidable constitution. Holmes spoke wistfully of keeping bees, of studying their habits and perhaps writing the definitive practical handbook on beekeeping with some observations upon the segregation of the queen. In 1903 or 1904, Holmes made his decision final. He would retire from active practice as a consulting detective and withdraw to the countryside, to the Sussex Downs on England's southern coast, where the air was clean and the pace of life altogether slower than in London's bustling streets. Watson chronicled one of their final cases together during this period. The adventure of the second stain, which involved matters of such delicate international importance that Watson waited years before daring to publish his account. It was the kind of case that had always energized Holmes. Complex, politically significant, requiring both intellectual brilliance and careful discretion. Holmes purchased a small villa on the Sussex Downs, near the village of Fulworth, with views across the rolling hills toward the English Channel. There he established himself with his books, his chemicals, and most importantly, his bees. The great detective, who had spent decades immersed in the darkest aspects of human nature, now devoted himself to these industrious insects, finding in their ordered society and instinctive behaviors a kind of peace that the chaos of criminal investigation had never provided. He kept several hives, tended them with meticulous care, and began compiling notes for his book on practical beekeeping and bee culture. Watson visited Holmes at his Sussex retreat when his own obligations allowed, and during these visits, the two old friends would walk across the downs together, talking of past cases and present concerns. Watson noticed that retirement had not entirely dimmed Holmes's faculties. His mind remained sharp, his powers of observation undiminished, though he claimed to use them now only to study the habits of bees and the behaviors of birds rather than the criminal elements of society. Yet Watson suspected that Holmes still kept himself informed of major crimes and investigations, still read the newspapers with that keen analytical eye, still could not entirely suppress the instinct to deduce and analyze everything around him. In 1907, Watson himself retired from his medical practice, though whether this was due to age, health, or simply a desire to spend more time writing is unclear from his accounts. By this time, Watson was in his mid-50s at least, possibly older depending on which birthdate one accepts for him, and the physical demands of maintaining a medical practice. The house calls at all hours, the emergencies, the constant availability required, may have become too taxing. His war wound continued to trouble him, and the years of adventures with Holmes, while exhilarating, had taken their physical toll. The limp that had marked him since Afghanistan was now more pronounced, and Watson moved with the careful deliberation of a man conscious of his body's limitations. During this period of semi-retirement for both men, Watson devoted considerable time to preparing more of their cases for publication. He went through his notes and journals from decades of investigations, selecting which adventures to write up and which to leave in the files, either because they were too sensitive, too personal, or simply because the world was not yet ready for them. Some cases, he decided, would never be published during his lifetime. Matters involving royal personages, scandals that could still destroy reputations, or investigations whose full truth might damage innocent parties. It was in 1912 that Holmes and Watson were drawn into one final, significant case together. An investigation that Watson would title his last beau, though it would not truly be their last collaboration. The case involved German espionage in the years leading up to what would become the Great War. Holmes, despite his retirement, had been conducting a 2-year undercover operation, posing as an Irish-American agent named Alta Morn and infiltrating a German spy network operating in England. The work required every ounce of Holmes's skill at disguise and deception, and when the time came to spring the trap, Holmes called upon Watson to assist him. Watson, now in his 60s and grey-haired, responded to his friend's summons without hesitation. On an August evening in 1914, just as Europe was plunging into war, Watson drove his small car, for even Watson had adapted to the modern age of motorcars, to meet Holmes on the terrace of his Sussex villa. There, in the twilight, with the lights of ships visible far out on the channel, the two old friends brought down a dangerous German agent named von Bork and delivered his network's secrets to the British government. It was a fitting culmination to their careers. One last service to their country, one last demonstration that age had not entirely dulled their abilities. Standing on that terrace, looking out across the channel toward a continent about to be engulfed in terrible war, Holmes spoke to Watson of the future. He was philosophical, even melancholic, recognizing that the world they had known, Victorian and Edwardian England with all its certainties and social structures, was passing away. The coming war would change everything, Holmes predicted, and indeed he was right. The Great War would shatter the old order, would claim millions of lives, would transform society in ways neither man could fully imagine. But they had done their duty, had served in their way, and could face whatever came with the satisfaction of lives well lived. Watson, listening to his friend speak of endings and transformations, felt the weight of all their years together. From that first meeting at Bart's Hospital so long ago, through adventures and dangers unnumbered, through separations and reunions, through all the cases solved and mysteries unraveled. They had grown old together, these two men, bound by a friendship that had become the defining relationship of both their lives. Watson had chronicled their adventures, but what he had really been recording all along was a friendship. Imperfect, tested, but ultimately unbreakable. And so we find them as the old world ends and a new, darker one begins. Two elderly gentlemen on a Sussex terrace, grey-haired and marked by time, but still capable, still sharp, still partners in every sense that mattered. The great adventures were mostly behind them now, the chronicles largely written, but the friendship endured, strong as ever, a testament to loyalty and mutual respect that had survived everything life could throw at it. Watson would return to London. Holmes would return to his bees, but the bond between them remained, would remain until the very end, whatever that end might be.